And here we are, episode 19, believe it or not, on Father's Day 2024. So, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there listening. Appreciate you tuning in, and even if you're not tuning in, happy Father's Day to all the dads. This is Beezy's Stream of Consciousness podcast. I am your humble host, Beezy, whom many songs and various incantations have been composed over the years. Coming to you from Starbase One studio. We want to thank those that have made this podcast possible. Audacity, the software on which I'm recording right now. Podbean is our distributor, and our music is courtesy of Soundroll. And we certainly appreciate everybody's help in making this possible, including you, for whom we do this every day. So, I guess let's get right into it. And with it being Father's Day, obviously, I've been on the interwebs this morning, and everybody's talking about their dads, and I figured I'd talk about mine. Dad was born in New Orleans on January 13th, 1930. He grew up in the Carrollton neighborhood of New Orleans. He lived in the same neighborhood, the same house for the first 11 years of his life. And then Grandpa moved the family to Vicksburg, where he had a sawmill, a planer mill with his brother. And so Dad started working for his dad, and later worked for their neighbor, or their neighbors. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Waterways Experiment Station was adjacent to Grandpa's property there. And so Dad worked there, and then later worked at a morgue, or an undertaker, and that's where he met my mother. She was working across the street in nurses training at Mercy Hospital in Vicksburg, and they married and moved back to New Orleans, where Dad went to work for Pontchartrain Motors. It was a Cadillac dealership there on Poydras Street, and stayed there until I think the early 50s, when the owner of that dealership asked him to transfer to a dealership that he had here in Fort Worth, Texas. And so they piled my two sisters, who had come along by that time, Jan and Kathy, and drove up, no AC, no interstates, here to Fort Worth. And Dad started working up here, and the dealership was originally in the stockyards, north side, and he loved to tell the story about how they could smell the aromas of the stockyards there at the dealership, and how pleasant that was to work under those conditions. But then Mr. Milner built a new dealership on University and the West Freeway, and brought in a general manager from Kansas City named Jack Williams to run the store for him as a minority partner. And Dad stayed on as the controller there, and remained there for many years until he got his money together to buy his own dealership, Holiday Link Mercury, on Forest Park Boulevard, in 1970. And he was a successful automobile dealer here in Fort Worth for 20 years. And when the dealerships closed, he worked as a consultant to a couple of other automobile dealers. I had the pleasure to work with him and for him at a couple of those postings. And but anyway, he eventually retired and moved to Gulfport, where he and Mom took care of my mom's mom in her later years. And when she passed, they moved back to Austin, and they were there for many years. They lived in South Austin off of Onion Creek, and but then in the latter years, they moved up here, back here to Fort Worth, um, where they had a home for, well, geez, from the 50s until mid 90s. So, but they moved back here. They got a nice little apartment not too far from where I am right now, and lived out um, their golden years and in relative happiness. Mom and Dad were married for 70 years. He sired four children. Myself, I'm the youngest. My brother, Gordon Jr., also known as Tex, may he rest in peace. And my two sisters, Jan and Kathy, they are the eldest. Janny is the eldest. Um, and anyway, he passed a few years ago. His health had been declining, and um, he he was having heart issues and had a stent put in, and um, it just a kind of a gentle decline from there, and then one Saturday he wasn't feeling right, and asked me to take him to the hospital, and I did. This is during COVID, so I couldn't go in with him. I dropped him off and went back to the apartment to sit with my mother. And they called me and said that Dad was having a cardiac event, and that I could come back to the hospital and pick up his personal things while they transported him to another hospital that had a cardiac unit. So I had a chance to talk to him briefly while he was on the gurney before they loaded him in the ambulance to take him up to Denton. Um, and then that night, I don't know exactly what they did to him up in Denton, but after whatever procedure they did, he called, and he was aggravated because he was hungry and they just wanted to give him oatmeal. So he was fussing about that a little bit. But the last thing I told him that I knew that he responded to is that I would see him the next morning during visiting hours. That night, the hospital called and said that he was having difficulty breathing and that they were going to put him in the ICU, and that I could come see him in the morning. They were going to help him breathe. And so I was getting dressed the next morning to go there, and the hospital called and said I needed to come up immediately, that he was deteriorating. So Susan and I went up. Um, uh, Dad was on a ventilator. He wasn't conscious, and they were working on him. And the ER doctor came to me and said that they just, they could keep working on him, but his kidneys were wrecked, and there were various other problems, and he was just going. He was circling the drain, as they say, and so I called my mother and I said, "What do you want to do, Mom?" And she said, "Well, your dad doesn't want to live like that, so let him go." And so I communicated that to the doctor. Did have a advance directive and a living will, and he had been very specific that he didn't want to be kept alive artificially, and then the family agreed and abided by his wishes. So we called in the priest. He received last rites. Susan and I were there with him, and we were there when they unplugged and everything, and he slipped away. So, but that's my dad, Gordon Francis Bailey Sr., January 13th, 1930 to September 6th, 2020. Is that 90 years? Yeah, 90. Lived 90 years, was married for 70 of them. And anyway, I miss Dad. I had a lot of good memories. He taught me a lot of things. He was a good guy, and he loved his family, and he loved his faith, and He died in the arms of the church, and I'm very grateful for that. So anyway, happy Father's Day, Dad. So let's go ahead and break out the book and move into our next chapter. All right, here we go with chapter 9 of Cloaks and Barbs. Urquhart Castle, Scotland. Paddy MacDonald slowly picked his way through the ruins of the ancient castle, humming fragments of old Gaelic folk tunes as he navigated the moss-covered stones and muddy puddles, carrying a grease-stained, torn old sack. The rain had stopped an hour or so before, and the clouds had just begun to break up, revealing the waxing moon, which illuminated the still water of the loch beyond the castle. A light wind blew from the northwest. It was cool, dry, and pleasant. Paddy stopped at the edge of the ruins, dropped the old sack off his shoulders, and breathed deeply. The Shetland sheepdog that had been trailing behind him finally caught up to him and began nosing among the turf with her fox-like tail curled over her broad brown and white back. "Ah," he said, finally exhaling. "Nothing like a bit of breeze coming down from the islands, is there, Mary? Invigorates us, doesn't it?" Mary stopped her foraging and looked back at her master, panting gently. Both dog and master appeared ancient. Paddy's long hair and beard were for the most part white, as was Mary's muzzle, which had long ago been brown. Both were hobbled by age. Paddy suffered from painful arthritis in his knees, while his canine companion had it in her hips. Still, they never missed their evening pilgrimages from Paddy's little hut on the outskirts of Drumnadrochit, 2 miles away, down to see the moon rise over Urquhart Castle and to visit the waters of Loch Ness. Paddy was a Scotsman, proud of his Highland heritage, and had never ventured far from the western shore of the loch, having been born in Inverness 71 years earlier. He had moved with his brother a few miles south of the village as a young man, where the two of them had made their modest living as glassmakers. Paddy's brother, Seamus, had left to join the British Army in the Second Boer War and had fought with distinction during the action around western Transvaal, where he had lost his right eye and right foot to Boers' small arms and artillery. After receiving treatment for his wounds, he had mustered out of the service and eventually returned to Scotland to rejoin Paddy, making various glass items in the tiny workshop behind their hut. Now, however, age was taking its toll on him. He was nearly blind from cataracts in his one good eye, and arthritis had rendered his once powerful hands into little more than useless claws. He no longer even made the daily treks with his brother down to the waters of the loch, being content to sit in his rocking chair on the porch of their hut and daydream, and occasionally tend to the still in the back garden where he and Paddy produced their own malt whiskey. Paddy, on the other hand, was still quite active, his knees notwithstanding. He dealt quite effectively with the pain by drinking copious amounts of his home-distilled spirits, and would wander up and down the western shore of the loch in the evenings, trailed by his ever-faithful Mary. In times past, he had a barrow that he would cart to the various settlements round about, gathering bits of scrap glass, which he would take back to his workshop and grind down to make drinking glasses, bowls, windows, and bulbs. MacDonald and MacDonald Limited's proficiency in glass crafting had attracted the attention of the local Ministry of Defense prefect down in Edinburgh shortly after hostilities had broken out in 1939, and now Paddy no longer had to scrounge for his raw materials. Every Tuesday morning, an army lorry would come down from Inverness and deposit hundredweight sacks of sand and soda ash in front of the hut, which Paddy would take back to his workshop and shape into windscreens for RAF Spitfires, Tempests, Mosquitoes, and Lancasters. Even though Seamus was understandably no longer able to help his brother craft the glass, Paddy was able to meet his quota each week, usually by Friday afternoon. As a craftsman, he found pleasure in the work itself, and as a Scotsman, he reveled in the knowledge that he was helping defend his land against the bloody Huns. The monetary compensation was not much, but it did not matter to the MacDonald brothers as long as they had money enough to keep barley and yeast in the still, and bread, sausage, and mutton on the table. Tonight, Seamus had consumed his customary 4 fingers of whiskey and sat before the fire in their hut, staring sleepily into the dancing flames, while Paddy bustled and busied himself cleaning up the remains of their mutton, potato, and cabbage supper. Mary happily gnawed rinds on the threadbare rug before the hearth when the rain had fallen outside. "Are you still going out tonight, brother?" Seamus had asked drowsily. "Aye," Paddy had replied. The rain'll let up directly, and she'll be getting hungry. Wouldn't want her to, or any of the wee bairns to have to eat the Finnegans, maybe?" Seamus chuckled, closed his good eye, and settled comfortably into his chair. "Right," he said as he drifted off to sleep. "Give her me love now. There's a good chap." "I'll do it, brother. She'll be right keen to see me tonight, she will. I've got a sack full of bones, but good meat still on 'em. Good night to you." Right about the time that Seamus began snoring, the rain had ceased and the wind died down. Paddy had completed his washing up duties and stepped outside. He could see the clouds breaking up and the moon beginning her rise. He stepped back inside, grabbed his tam off the coat tree, and gathered up the greasy bag that lay next to the door. "Come along, Mary," he called to the dog. "It's time, lass." He had skirted the loch's western shore, being careful to avoid a couple of the well-known infamous bogs that lay at the water's edge just south of the village. Mary followed silently, for the most part, although twice she stopped and looked towards the water, growling softly. "Och, now," Paddy would chide. "Behave yourself there, animal. You don't want to make her angry. Like last time, do you?" Mary had stopped her growling, but kept a wary eye on the loch as they approached the ruins of Urquhart Castle on one of the headlands overlooking the water. Paddy liked coming here, partly out of a sense of Scottish nationalism. Urquhart had been defended, lost, and recaptured many times by the Scotch since the time of St. Columba in the 6th century, and was thus a symbol of national pride, but mostly because it was one of the few places that he could safely visit another one of Loch Ness's attractions. The light of the moon shone down on the surface of the loch, and Paddy could hear the strange piping of night birds, along with the chirp of crickets and the gentle croaking of toads. He looked back down the path that led from the castle to the Fort Augustus Road. No one was about. He smiled, bent down, and opened the bag. Mary immediately came to his side, panting and wagging her long, bushy tail happily. Now, Paddy said to her, closing the bag quickly and admonishing her with a shaking finger. "You know the rules, dog. She gets to eat her fill, and any of her bairns first, mind, and then you can have any scraps. I don't know why you're still so hungry. I gave you 2 whole mutton legs tonight. Come on, then. Let's get down to the water and see what we can see." He hoisted the bag onto his shoulder, shuffled down to the very edge of the water, which was very still. A faint breeze blew across the surface, but caused no ripples. He made one last look round, and satisfied that they were alone, he brought his hands to his mouth. He made a curious clicking noise with his tongue that echoed faintly over the loch. Twice more he did this and waited. "She should be along any time now," he said softly. After another few minutes, he could discern a series of ripples beginning near the center of the loch, almost 75 yards away from where he stood. Mary's ears perked up, and she growled softly. "Steady on," Paddy said. "Don't want to scare her off now, do we?" The ripples appeared to be moving towards him, and soon there was no doubt about it. Something very large was approaching just beneath the surface of the water. He opened the bag and withdrew the headless, featherless carcass of a large hen. Mary's muzzle began to drip, and her pink tongue ran back and forth over her lips as she watched her master expectantly. Paddy held the chicken out at arm's length and again made the curious clicking noise. "Come on, me dear," he said. "Paddy's got your lovely pullet air, and some lovely bits of mutton to boot. Let's see her now." The subsurface disturbance slowed its approach until it stopped about 10 yards from the shore, and presently a dark mass began to rise out of the water. Mary gave a sharp bark and stood next to Paddy, bristling and growling. The shape rose slowly until it stopped some 8 feet above the surface of the loch, on a long, slender neck, somewhat thicker than an elephant's trunk. The wedge-shaped head swung gracefully from side to side, and the 2 dark eyes on either side blinked in the moonlight as it looked up and down the loch. It finally stopped and looked down at Paddy holding the chicken. It appeared to be reptilian, for the skin was smooth and greenish-gray, like a newt or a salamander. The long mouth open, revealing row after row of conical, sharp teeth. There was a long exhale of breath, and a reddish-pink muscular tongue came forth to lick around the smooth jowls. Mary looked up at the creature, and her growls became louder. Without taking his eyes off of the beast, Paddy pointed with his free hand to the ground and said quietly, yet firmly, "Mary, down." The dog quickly sat on her haunches and whimpered softly. Paddy lifted the chicken high above his head, and the creature followed the motion closely. "Ready for some grub, are we, me love?" he asked. The creature opened its mouth wide and gave a loud hiss, filling Patty's nostrils with the smell of fish and dead vegetation. "Here you go," he said, and he threw the chicken into the air towards the beast. It easily caught the bird in its mouth, chewed it briefly, and then swallowed. "You want more, love?" he asked, and reached into the bag, again keeping his eyes on the creature. "Here's a nice leg of fat valley mutton," he said as he drew out a raw, skinned lamb hind quarter. The creature hissed again and bobbed its head. Patty threw it out over the water, but it was far heavier than the bird, and it fell a couple of feet short of its mark and splashed into the water. The creature craned its neck and lowered its head into the shallows until it rose again with the mutton dangling from the side of its mouth. Patty chuckled as he watched it chew the lamb slowly. "That's right," he said softly, almost lovingly. "Chew your food, lass. There's more to come. As long as Patty has breath in me body, you'll never have to go hungry. Now where are the bairns, eh?" As if in answer, the creature stopped its chewing and ducked its head under the water to either side. There was some splashing, and as the monster raised its head, there appeared two more animals, one on either side of the first. They were smaller, not much larger than Mary, and their necks were not quite 3 feet long. They were much more vocal than the adult as they looked at Patty, opening their small mouths and emitting strange squeaking chirps, almost like birds. The adult looked down at them and allowed some of the mutton to fall from its mouth into the water in front of them. With excited squeals, the two juveniles began eating. Patty's face broke into a wide grin. "There you are," he said happily. "Getting bigger every day, you are." He looked up at the adult. "You're doing great there, Mum," he said proudly. The youngsters quickly consumed the mutton and looked around the water for more, squealing excitedly. Now, Patty said as he reached into his bag. "There's more to come." He pulled out 2 more chicken carcasses and flung them into the water where the youngsters tore into them. "Seamus is back home, and he'll be making some haggis for supper tomorrow," he said to the adult. "Good stuff, that. Perhaps I'll bring you a bit tomorrow night, eh?" The adult looked down at him and hissed softly as if in approval, while at her side the juveniles made short work of their chickens. Patty beamed as he watched them. As far as he was concerned, all was right with the world. Wolf Schanze. "So, Speer," said Hitler, "now that you've seen them, what do you think of them?" The Chancellor put his booted feet up on his desk and leaned back as his Minister of Armaments and Chief Architect poured himself a drink of apple schnapps from the tiny bar against the far wall. There were dark circles under Albert Speer's eyes, and his party uniform was rumpled from having spent the last 3 hours in a Daimler staff car racing to the wolf's lair at his master's request. Following this was a brief meeting with the 3 alien visitors who were holding forth in the guest lounge 2 floors above the Fuhrer's private study, an event which had left him quite shaken. "Ugh," said Bormann, casting a disgusted look at the bottle as Speer poured. "How can you drink that stuff?" "Oh, it's not so bad," Goebbels said as he quaffed a glassful. He, too, had made a mad dash across Germany to join this late-night conference of the Fuhrer's inner circle to discuss the Reich's new alliance with Der Bersücher. "It's better than that French crap you drink, Martin." "Be still, gentlemen," Hitler said impatiently. "I want to hear what he has to say." "Well," Speer said somewhat shakily as he sat next to the others, meeting them was something of a shock, of course. "I admit to you all that I had no idea that such people existed." "Oh, they're not people, Albert," Goebbels said as he poured himself another glass. "They're creatures from another world, no less. And I guarantee you that thanks to them, our business with the Allies just got infinitely easier. With their intervention, we'll have America and England off of our backs, which will give us a free hand on the continent. After that stupid move by Victor Emmanuel to replace our friend El Duce, my people have contacted Badaglio about expatriating him to us, by the way. And the incompetence of that traitor Paulus at Stalingrad. God knows we can use the help." He threw back his drink and settled deeper into his chair while his bloodshot eyes grew decidedly glassy. "I'm not so sure," Speer said slowly, swirling his drink around in his brandy glass. "I'm not so sure I like this arrangement," he added as he looked up at Hitler. "He talks like Rommel," Bormann said with a sniff. "And donuts." Speer cocked an eyebrow. "Really?" he asked. "Our best field commander and Craig's Marine officer agree on this?" He took a quick sip of the schnapps. "They're good men both with sound judgments. Perhaps we should listen to them." "And our judgments are kacke?" Bormann retorted with some heat. "The Fuhrer signed off on this, you know. The matter has been decided already. You would do well to remember your place, Speer." Speer's cheeks and ears flushed briefly, but it was Goebbels who spoke next. "Let him be, Martin," he said with a yawn. Hold fast for his impressions. So I did, Hitler said, reaching into one of his desk drawers. He brought out an orange and began peeling it. Go on, Speer, he said as he made a small pile of rind on his desk blotter. Joseph is correct. I asked you to speak. Tell us your concerns. Speer took another swallow as he gathered his thoughts. Someone mentioned that these creatures were interested in Scotland, of all places, he said slowly. I should like to know what possibly could be of value there. They wouldn't say, Hitler said flatly, although they used the term harvesting when the issue came up. What do you think could be harvested in Scotland, Joseph? There are many things that the British get in Scotland, Goebbels said, rubbing his temples tiredly. There's coal in abundance as well as zinc, oil, shale, and iron, I believe, lots of minerals. All of which can be had in other parts of the world, Speer said. What else? Agriculture, Bormann put in. Potatoes, wheat, barley, and the like. Dairy cattle, sheep, and so forth. Whiskey, Goebbels added with a smile, but Bormann winced. Scotch whiskey, he scoffed. How abominable. A drink for savages. To each his own, Speer said. None of that would be reason enough to intervene in this war on our behalf. He shook his head. No, none of this makes sense. All of the minerals that you named can be mined in abundance elsewhere and with much less fuss. The same with livestock and produce. I'm sure these creatures could start their own gardens somewhere other than Scotland. And as for the whiskey, I cannot imagine that a race such as theirs would invade our planet just to get that. Hitler nodded in agreement as he began separating peeled sections of orange. There has to be more to their tale than this. That's what I said, the Fuhrer said as he shoved a section into his mouth. As he chewed, his tiny mustache quivered and his blue eyes sparkled. Our visitors are quite mysterious about the entire Scotland affair. However, if we're to take them at their word, soon we will no longer have to worry about the British or the Americans. We can then redirect our efforts on the Eastern Front, consolidate our efforts in France and Italy. Just like that, Speer asked, these creatures will restrict their activities to the British Isles and leave the rest of Europe to us? He shook his head again and resumed swirling his schnapps nervously. I'm sorry, mein Führer, but I simply do not believe them. What proof do you have that they will keep their end of the bargain? By way of answer, Hitler put down the uneaten half of his orange and reached into another drawer. He pulled out a small glass jar containing 3 small opaque orbs suspended in what appeared to be clear fluid and placed it on his desk. This, he said to Speer, is their pledge of goodwill. When Speer began to pick it up, Hitler added sharply, do be careful with that. Speer withdrew his hand quickly. What are those things? He asked as his fear and fatigue gave way to curiosity. Those, said Bormann with an ironic smile, are the life force repositories of our 3 visitors. They were given to us on deposit, so to speak. Damage them and the aliens take injury. Crush them and the aliens die, or so they told us. What? Asked Goebbels, sitting up straight in his chair. That's incredible. That's what that witch Dr. Mengele said, Bormann muttered. The 2 of you should spend more time together, Joseph. You have so much in common. Goebbels ignored the bar, but instead bent over the Fuhrer's desk, studying the jar from various angles. How is this possible, he asked. Hitler shrugged as he ate the other half of his orange. We do not know, he admitted, although there will come a time that Mengele will be allowed to, study them more in depth. He smiled darkly and chewed his fruit. Speer went pale and looked at the others. But you said. Speer, Hitler said in a tone that he might have used to explain matters to a child, how have we always dealt with our allies once their usefulness is depleted? Bormann grinned devilishly and nodded as did Goebbels. Just as there is only one Fuhrer, he continued, putting his feet on the floor and sitting up ramrod straight, there can only be one Reich and only one power in Europe. With the help of der Besucher, the United States and Great Britain will cease to be a problem for us. That will allow me to throw Rommel, von Rundstedt, and Modella into Russia, where we will at last be victorious. Unter den Himmel, Barbarossa will be resurrected, and Uncle Joseph will be brought before me in chains, where he will die of a 9mm hemorrhage. That will take care of the so-called red problem. No more damn Bolsheviks. With Russia under our influence, no one can stand before us. France is already under my heel, and Italy will quickly learn how I deal with traitors. Hitler licked the ends of his fingers sticky with orange residue. Speer looked with horror at the Chancellor. But mein Führer, he stammered, what of our Japanese friends and China? Our dear friend Hirohito will join Il Duce and Uncle Joseph, Hitler said coldly. We shall see to it that the rising sun will at last set permanently. And as for China, She will have been severely weakened from her long battle with Japan. We will let General Chang and that communist monster Zedong fight amongst themselves. Whoever emerges victorious will be worn out, and the country will be ripe for the picking. Our picking, of course. Spear swallowed hard and nodded jerkily. And America? He asked in a small voice. She will not sit idly by while we... America will be grateful that we intervened on her behalf in the Pacific, Hitler continued, as both the volume and tone of his voice rose. All three of his subordinates recognized the light in his eyes, the light he usually reserved for his impassioned speeches to the Volkssturm. Our Wehrmacht will be marching through Tokyo while Nimitz and MacArthur are still fighting in malaria-infested island jungles. No, Speer. Roosevelt will welcome our assistance, for which he will gladly pay our price. And what price would that be? Speer asked quietly. America will agree by treaty never again to once take to the sea or air belligerently. Oh, she can see to her own internal matters, of course, but she will become quite impotent internationally. Our South American friends in Brazil and Argentina will expand our influence in the New World, and we will encourage the changing of the guard in Central America until we have a buffer in Mexico. He grinned like a man possessed and smoothed back his oily hair. America will be contained with her own borders until such time as we decide to move against her. And move against her we shall, in due time. My God, Speer breathed. Yes, Speer, Hitler said, his eyes aflame with an otherworldly light that all three men had seen many times before. Yes, our Reich will truly last 1,000 years. Speer stared at his Fuhrer with his mouth open, unable to speak as his mind attempted to wrap itself around Hitler's latest vision. Again, it was Goebbels who broke the silence by politely clearing his throat. It will be glorious indeed, Wolf, he said solicitously. Now, I'm sure our Minister of Armaments would like to hear what will happen to Der Besuchen. Hitler's eyes narrowed and his hands balled into fists. He leaned forward over his desk and glared at his three closest advisors menacingly. His breath blew his cheeks out and his mustache twitched. When the time is right, he said slowly, emphasizing every word, we will harvest our visitors just as they will have done in Scotland, so that no power on earth beneath it nor above it will ever be able to threaten the fatherland. Our heavy water project in Norway is back in business, and soon we will have atomic super bombs that our V-series rockets and rocket planes will carry anywhere in Europe. Der Besuchen, along with the rest of Scotland, will be reduced to cinders. Our victory will be complete. Santiago 4. Well, that's bloody curious, Hawthorne said as he surveyed the electrical junction boxes in the utility closet at the north end of the underground listening post. Barbara stood next to him holding a paraffin lamp. Every damned fuse is blown. He unscrewed one of the circular fuses from the master panel and surveyed it under the lamplight. The glass middle section housing the fusible link was blackened. Must have been a mighty lightning strike up top to do this sort of devil's work. You have spares, sir? Barbara asked. Behind her, Carstairs and Desjardins stood with their own lamps, while the other operators waited in their quarters. Of course, Lieutenant, Barbara said. Shine that bit of light over here, will you? Barbara moved so that he could see as he rummaged through the box tucked in the far corner of the closet. The women could hear him muttering to himself as he looked through the box, and at last he produced a small packet labeled Fuses 30 amp Polyswitch Limited Ipswich. Here we are, he said triumphantly. I'll have our lights back on in a jiff. While he busied himself unscrewing the burned-out fuses and replacing them, Barbara looked over her shoulder at Carstairs. I wonder if old Roger is weathering the storm all right up there, she mused, motioning up with a jerk of her chin. He's probably in the dark as well, Carstairs said, but he's a sly old fox. He's got packets and packets of candles handy, not to mention probably a gross of these here paraffin lamps. We call it kerosene in the States, dear, Barbara said with a smile. Lanterne de la paraffine, Desjardins added. All three women shared a quiet giggle. I'm sure the old dear is just fine, Carstairs said. He had made short work of the sentry, as well as the other two humans in the dwelling. The sentry and the older human had been easy to kill, as they had been more or less incapacitated already. The third human could not see him approach in the darkness and did not realize that its life was in danger until it felt his long feelers around its neck. Soon it lay next to the old human, its neck neatly snapped. None of these three, however, were members of the communications team for which he sought, and now he looked around, trying to find their method of descent into the underground complex. He found what he was looking for in a sort of storage locker in the food preparation area. The air was beginning to foul with smoke from some untended food cooking on a gas range, but that did not concern him. His sight told him that a small fire would soon start and later consume most of the above-ground structure, but he knew there was a high probability that he will have completed neutralizing the communications team long before then. Only one of the communications humans could be considered a warrior by his standards, and that one was aged and crippled. The others were weak females who had no combat experience and limited weapons training. There were steep stairs leading down from the storage locker, and he began his slow descent into the darkness. U-534. Our battery reserves are getting dangerously low, Capitan, von Kuiper warned. We will have to risk a surface soon, or he allowed his captain to finish the thought for him. Wirtz glanced at the battery gauges near the plainsman's station and winced. Von Kuiper was correct. The indicators for voltage in the U-boat's batteries were nearing the red area, and those for the amperage were already at zero. They were 40 meters beneath the surface of the English Channel and running at their maximum submerged speed of 4 knots, heading for the openness of the Celtic Sea where they could maneuver. Hugging the English coast to evade their American adversaries was taking them farther and farther from their own sea lanes and farther from home. What of the American boats? He asked a sonar operator. They are still surface, sir, said the young radioman, about 10 miles south of us. The noisy boat is about 2 miles ahead of the quiet one, and they are doing 10 knots. Surface conditions have improved, too. The worst of the storm is past. The sea has quieted. Wirtz grunted. Now the Americans are between us and the French coast, he said sadly, and there is no telling if there are any more of their boats about. He rubbed his face worriedly and looked at von Kuiper while he pondered their situation. Perhaps we could turn north, the executive officer suggested softly. We could steam into the Bristol Channel. The Americans will not expect this. They're obviously waiting for us to turn south towards them, and we can use the darkness of the small hours to surface and recharge our batteries. At dawn, we submerge and wait until tomorrow night to move south again under cover of darkness. It's risky, Wirtz said slowly. That's shallow water right between Wales and Cornwall. The British no doubt have surface patrol craft about, not to mention coast watchers. He scowled as he continued to think it over. I don't know about this, Herman, he said. Well, what are our options, my Capitan? Von Kuiper asked. We could motor out to seaward on batteries as far as we can and then turn south. But every turn of our screws brings us closer to Allied shipping lanes where the Americans have their hunter-killer groups. Intelligence reports that there are 2 American Block Island-class small aircraft carriers operating on those waters. They carry torpedo planes with depth bombs, sir, and have been quite successful of late against our Type 7 boats. We should avoid the westward coast at all costs, I think. He leaned against the periscope. We could turn south and try to creep past them, but I fear we lack the battery power to do it. To surface and make a run for it would play right into their hands and probably mean a very unhappy end for us. No, sir, I advise we take the course that makes the least tactical sense to them. Wirtz moved over to the chart table and studied the area in question. Only 50 kilometers wide, he said quietly, and shallow as hell. It'd be very easy to get trapped in there, you know. And there is only one tide cycle per day there, my Capitan von Kuiper said. We will be on the surface during low tide while it's dark, but the tide will come in during the morning so that we can rest on the bottom in safety with plenty of water on top of our conning tower. The Tommies will never know that we're there. Wirtz thought for a moment. He finally smiled and clapped von Kuiper's shoulder, even as he shook his head. You are a crafty one, Herman, he said, and a pretty fair salesman. Reduce speed to 2 knots and make your course for the Bristol Channel. Have sonar. Keep me informed of the American boat's movements. He rubbed his eyes. I'm going to try to have a rest, Herman. You have the con. USS Barb. I still can't believe Jones sent that boat out, Dunaway said. Snell deserves a Navy Cross just for taking her to sea, much less engaging a U-boat. He stood on the bridge while Matthews and the usual watchstanders and lookouts peering through his binoculars at S-24 2 miles ahead as she motored back to her patrol area. The 2 boats had rendezvoused earlier, and the 2 captains had briefly conferred over their tactical situation, agreeing to allow the German quarry to temporarily escape. Matthews had been confident that as long as he kept Barb between the U-boat and the French coast, it could not get past him. He had, however, been aghast at the condition of Snell's command and had implored him to return to Portsmouth. Snell, to his credit, declined, After tasting battle, he was anxious for more, even in the dilapidated S-24. What the man really deserves is a court-martial for refusing to take that pig back to the barn like I told him, Matthews said. That boat's damn near unseaworthy. How can you fight a boat like that when you can't even navigate? Dunaway looked up and squinted at the moon, which was at last unmasked now that the storm system had moved towards the Iberian Peninsula. He could see the stars twinkling brightly through the rapidly breaking clouds. Well, at least he's got the stars, sir, he said. I ought to break radio silence and call in some relief for him, Matthews continued. If he stumbles across another crowd boat, it's going to be Katie bar the door. Speaking of which, where do you think our German friend went? He did not add his deep personal misgiving at letting the German escape, even if it was towards the English coast. He felt it would be difficult in the extreme to reacquire the boat with sonar, but he knew his captain and knew there would be no arguing with him once his mind was made up. I know exactly where he went, Robert. That's why we're following this course. We can keep an eye on Snell up there, but we can also find Jerry. Dunaway blinked. I don't follow you, sir. Jerry's a smart one, Matthews said. He hasn't turned south yet, and he won't anytime soon, not if my hunch is right. No, he's headed right where I would go if I were in his boots. And where's that, sir? Matthews turned and smiled at Dunaway as if he had all the answers to all the questions. North. All right, kiddies, that was chapter 8, I think, of Cloaks and Barbs. We'll read 9 tomorrow. Things are happening really fast in the book, as you can tell. But I'm not going to give you any spoilers. It's just things are happening quick, and if you haven't been keeping up, I invite you to go back and listen to previous podcasts so that you can get caught up on all the goings on in Cloaks and Barbs. And and just to let you know, that is available on Amazon under the author's name, which is me, Joseph M. Bailey, or under the title Cloaks and Barbs. Feel free to get you a copy if you're like me and like reading off paper, at least some of the time. So anyway, do appreciate you spending part of your Father's Day with me, and let me prattle on about my dad. But Father's Day comes once a year, so. This evening we've got a get together over at Layla's. The kids are going to feed me a Tex-Mex feast, and we'll play games and enjoy some good family time. Definitely looking forward to that. So we do have a busy week up ahead. With that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So have a great day. Remember that love you send out the dreams to you and